Welcome back. All right, so I want to talk about draft steals today. Today we're going to talk about draft picks from 1981 through 1995. For it to qualify as a draft steal, it to me has to be outside the first round, especially back in the early 80s where you had 21 draft picks in the first round. So anybody after that first round could be a steal. It does mean I'm going to have to modify this a bit as we get into later years. So when I'm doing 96 through 2010, there may be some really late first round draft picks that might say, you know what, that was a steal. That being said, I've picked one player from each season to highlight as a steal. One that's not appearing on this list is Pavel Bure, and the greatest draft steals. I used him for the image that for the thumbnail for that video. So it's gonna be a little different today. So we'll start in 1981. In 1981, the Montreal Canadiens selecting 40th overall. They draft Chris Chelios. Chelios had a fantastic career in Montreal and then in Chicago and Detroit. Wherever Chelios played, he was a fantastic player for the most part. I mean, towards the end of his career, sure, there were some holes in his game, but I mean, as you get older, right? But Chelios, Hall of Fame defenseman, the fact that they get him at 40th, I qualify that as a steal. 1982, St. Louis drafting number 134. Doug Gilmour. You know, one thing I've noticed looking back at older videos, my penmanship is much better than it was 6, 7 years ago when it comes to these videos. Anyways, Doug Gilmour drafted 134th by the St. Louis Blues. He's a pretty good player. Scored a bunch of points in St. Louis, and then Calgary, and then Toronto. Bounced around a bit towards the end of his career, but yeah, really good career, and obviously Hall of Famer. So I feel like Gilmour at 134th qualifies as a steal. From 1983, and I almost missed this one. To be honest, I almost did. I had Rick Tocchet on the board, or on the paper here, and then I was like, well, wait, no, let's look through. I think, and I was right. So Chicago drafting 199th overall, they draft Dominik Hasek. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that Hasek was behind the Iron Curtain at that point, so not as easy to get him to come over and play. It was a long time after this before he'd come over and play, and obviously he's best remembered as being a Buffalo Sabre. But Chicago gets themselves a bit of a steal here. The problem being when they traded him, that was not a great trade for the Chicago Blackhawks. 1984, it's gonna be a number 51 draft pick. Another Hall of Fame goaltender, Patrick Roy. And maybe during the summer I need to do a video on goaltenders drafted early, goaltenders drafted late, and the number of times that a goaltender drafted early doesn't necessarily hit, and the times a goaltender drafted late has been very, very good. Henrik Lundqvist comes to mind, but at 51st, Patrick Roy, that's pretty good. So those are two steals from Montreal, Chris Chelios and Patrick Roy, and this is why when we talk about general managers in the draft, we talk about being able to get those hits outside the first round. It's great if you can get those superstar players early, but if you're not able to find those steals or really good players in rounds 2 and beyond, you're going to have those star players and then not a lot around them. For 1985, a Vancouver Canucks draft pick. It was number 214. Igor Larionov. Larionov, and I've talked about this story before, but I always felt like it was a shame he didn't stay in Vancouver. But once he came over, and again, this was a pick made before the Iron Curtain came down. So at the time the Canucks draft Igor Larionov in 1985, there's no real idea that they're going to get him. And so they drafted him. They drafted Krutov as well. The one where they missed out is they didn't draft Makarov. And it's too bad because if they'd had the KLM line just for like a few games, it would have been awesome to see. But at any rate, Larionov ends up leaving Vancouver after his initial contract's done because the Canucks would have had to pay another transfer payment to the Russian Hockey Federation, and Larionov didn't want that. So he ends up going to San Jose. Goes on to Detroit and has a fantastic time there and wins Stanley Cups and things of that nature, ends up in the Hall of Fame. But he started out in Vancouver, and he was one of my favorite players in Vancouver. He was such a complete player. And you look at his career and how many games he played, and then remember, when he came over, he was already in his late 20s. So if he'd come over earlier, we'd be talking about Larionov in the same, I think, in the same vein as like Crosby and some of these players. Because again, at the time Larionov came over, he was not in his early 20s. He was not at his most dynamic, and the early 80s and the NHL points were being handed out like candy. So really, if Larionov had come over sooner, who knows? 1986. It is Detroit's first turn on the board. It's not going to be their last. Drafting 22nd. So this is where, for future videos, it could be a first round draft pick because this is technically a second round draft pick, right? It's Adam Graves. Adam Graves, another player who is not primarily known as a Red Wing because he ends up going to the Oilers, being part of the kid line there, winning a Stanley Cup. Then he goes to the Rangers and he becomes a bit of a legend for the New York Rangers, of course. But Graves started out in Detroit, again, the number 22 pick, and ends up being an excellent pick. So while Joe Murphy's number one draft pick status ends up being called into question plenty after that draft is done, um, Adam Graves is a fantastic pick. 1987. So for 1987, drafting 166th overall, Theo Fleury. Theoren Fleury was one of the best small players to play in the National Hockey League. Played a long time, won the Stanley Cup in Calgary in 1989, and of course went on to have a really, really good career. Ended up getting paid big time by the New York Rangers. He was one of the ones that went to the Rangers when the Rangers were handing out huge contracts. Don't blame him. There were a lot of veterans that went to New York on those big contracts, and some of them worked out, some of them didn't, but they all got paid. 1988. So we come up to the little bit past the halfway mark since there's 15 on this. And for Pittsburgh, drafting 67th overall, Mark Recchi. Mark Recchi played so many years in the NHL, won Stanley Cups in Pittsburgh, and then won a Stanley Cup with the Carolina Hurricanes too. In fact, I think to this day it's the longest period of time between Stanley Cup wins is from the 92 Penguins till the 06 Carolina Hurricanes. And Recchi was just an excellent team player. He had a Stanley Cup win as well in Boston. Did he have the Stanley Cup win in Carolina? I think he did. And then he had a Stanley Cup win in Boston as well. So, I mean, he was a winner. He played on winning teams. It's not a coincidence. Mark Recchi's a winner. And was drafted 67th overall by the Pittsburgh Penguins. So, again, yes, they draft Lemieux. Eventually, they draft Yager 5th overall. But you get hits like Recchi. Kevin Stevens was another steal they had as well. Stevens isn't on the board for this one, but I did make that mention. 1989, we are back to Detroit. Now, this is the Pavel Bure draft. And so I was kind of torn. I was like, well, you know, Bure was the guy that I had as the thumbnail. I don't know why that word's escaping me. I think it's just so many videos recently. But if I'm honest, and I like to try to be honest with myself as much as possible, Nicholas Lidstrom at 53rd by Detroit, absolute steal of a pick right there. And Lidstrom did have the more... It's hard to compare Lidstrom and Bure because Bure, obviously injuries slowed him down and ended his career early. Otherwise, we'd be talking about Bure as one of the greatest goal scorers of all time. He probably would have had about 700 goals. So maybe the difference between Lidstrom and Bure wouldn't be so big. But Lidstrom was the best defenseman of his era and arguably one of the best defensemen of all time. So you can't really go wrong with Lidstrom or Bure. But in this case, I'm taking the Lidstrom pick. 1990, it's a Washington logo going on the board for this one. And it is a number 156 pick, which is ridiculous. But it's another European player. So one thing to take note of here is how many of these players are either behind the Iron Curtain at the time they're drafted or they're just their European players. And European scouting, some teams really focused on it and other teams didn't, not nearly as much. Now it's a far more even playing field, but Capitals get themselves an absolute, it's robbery for them to get Bondra at 156th. One of the best goal scorers during his era. Bondra had a fantastic career. 1991, and it's another Detroit logo. It's another Detroit logo. I just realized too, I'm gonna have to do the 99 draft and look for huge steals there. But anyways, number 54 in 1991, Chris Osgood. Chris Osgood is a goaltender that I still think to this day is underrated. I think he should be in the Hall of Fame. I think that he played behind an absolutely stacked Detroit team, and so people said, well, he's an okay goaltender, but it's because he plays in Detroit that he's getting all these wins and all that. But I thought the last Stanley Cup that Osgood won proved he was a fantastic goaltender, and I'm surprised to this day that he's not in the Hall of Fame. I think he belongs there. So I'll beat that drum for as long as I have to, but Osgood at number 54, and I think this is what shows how Detroit was smart. And again, they added Larionov later in his career, and it really helped to boost them as a team. So Detroit made really smart decisions scouting-wise. Their pro scouts, too, and the way that the trades and free agency and all that was done. Detroit was really, really well run. 1992, the Jets are on the board now, picking 204th. Nikolai Khabibulin. Khabibulin, a really good goaltender, won a Stanley Cup in 2004 with the Tampa Bay Lightning, had a pretty good run with Arizona as well, and came into Winnipeg just before the move. So Khabibulin bounced around the league a little bit towards the end. I've actually thought about doing a Khabibulin career video because I know I haven't yet. There was one point where I started putting the board together and just it never ended up coming through. But there will be a Khabibulin video at some point on his career because it's an interesting career to look at. And again, Stanley Cup winner. So definitely, I think, a steal in that draft. Now we get into the Ottawa portion of the video. So 1993, drafting 227th. And you know what's interesting is that they draft Yashin early. And Yashin had some really good years, but couldn't get over the hump in the playoffs. Of course, they draft Dag, and Dag starts off pretty promising, and then it falls apart by about year 4. But later in the draft, they're getting some hits. And drafting 227th in 1993, they get Pavel Demitra. So another European player taken very, very late. And it just feels like with today's scouting, this can't happen anymore. You can't get a guy that good that late in the draft. It's just there's too many good scouts. There's too many dark corners where scouts weren't going back in the early 90s that they're going now. And this is part of the reason why teams start beefing up their European scouting and going a little more global in their thinking. Ottawa stays on the board in 1994, drafting 133rd overall. And you guys are going to be really surprised. It's another European player. Daniel Alfredsson. The other thing, too, when you're in the 80s and the 90s, there was kind of a stigma attached to European players that it was all skill. You really wanted a Canadian player for the toughness factor, and maybe they were a little bigger. And just these kinds of things seem to make a difference for some general managers. I remember the meltdown I had when the Canucks drafted Libor Polasek. I'm like, what do they do? And it's because he was a really big player. Oddly enough, European though. But yeah, Daniel Alfredsson at 133rd, that's a steal. So again, while their early draft picks may not have been fantastic for Ottawa in terms of franchise altering, they are hitting late. And this made the Ottawa Senators a bit of a powerhouse late in the 90s, early 2000s. Which brings us to 1995, and to close out this video, drafting 116th. Why not keep the theme going? First off, Mika Kiprasov, European goaltender. So it hits both, right? You've got a player from overseas, and they're a goaltender. So how many goaltenders on the list? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 out of 15 are goaltenders, right? Yep. And European players, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 out of 15 are European players. So, yeah, that'll cause your team to say, hey, we need to start paying more attention. Look at this guy that they got late, and look how good he is. Look how ready he is. So, yeah, there you go. The draft steals I wanted to highlight from each draft from 1981 through 1995. And there will be a video looking at 1996 through 2010. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always, including other draft steals from these drafts, because these are just ones I wanted to highlight. Ones I feel like are maybe the most dramatic or the most notable. But you guys can let me know your thoughts as well. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.